Thanks, Tim, for this fantastic intervention in the debate. I think there will be lots of questions in the audience. I have a few myself, and maybe I can use this opportunity to kind of kick off.
No one can stop you.
Exactly. It's a privileged position. So I think that your argument about zones of limited statehood, I find that very convincing. My only issue with it is that, on the one hand, as you already said, there is the perpetrating state, of course, is a highly functioning state, perhaps the most functioning state in a strange way in Western Europe at the time, with a very efficient administration which is regeared towards one purpose only in this case. And that, bizarrely, what the Germans do after this brief period of anarchy, 1941 in particular, what they're trying to do in a perverted way is to recreate order. That's how I read the construction of designated extermination camps as an attempt to end, for various reasons, primarily because they are concerned about the mental health of the perpetrators, to construct an order which will allow them to, crudely phrased, finish the job in an orderly way.
Yeah.
So it's partly about zones of limited statehood, but also about sort of perverted islands of order within these areas. I also find the argument generally very convincing in relation to, as you describe, Ukraine, Poland in particular, the completely shattered states. But in the case of, for example, Austria or the Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia, of course, from the Nazis' perspective, what they're doing is they are destroying an artificial states which were created in 1918. So they are restoring proper legitimacy and statehood by incorporating these territories into what they see as the greater German Reich. So there are zones of statelessness and also of reborn orders, if you like.
Yeah. I think the idea of some kind of order, or any sort of order, because I'm sure you can see that the notion of Treblinka as order is a very special notion of order. I mean, it means that rather than having dozens of large shooting pits, you have essentially a rail station where for the first several weeks people are shot as they come out of the trains because they haven't gotten the gassing operation figured out, and then after that people are gassed en masse. I mean, that may be order in the very restrictive sense that, as you say, it's keeping psychological problems down among German perpetrators. But from any other point of view, I think that's a very restrictive idea of order, and I don't think it clashes with the point that I'm trying to make about citizenship and the state, because by the time we get to this moment, by the time we get to 1942 and the experiments with Belzec and Helmno and so on, the Holocaust has already happened. It's already underway, and what we're trying to do is explain how a Holocaust can happen. This order I would define as a technical order rather than as a political order. Although I quite take your point about the difference. Now, and I mean the chronology is very important, because even the Jews who are going to be killed in these orderly places, just to take the word for a moment, are only going to be Jews who come from zones where political disorder has already been created, right? So Jews are only going to be killed in Treblinka if there is a reason to think of them as not having citizenship, which is an anterior act, right? So I take the point that the technique has been changed. The way my argument would work would be to stress that what we have to explain is how you get to the moment where the Germans realize that this is possible. And that has everything to do, I think, with this anti-politics, with this creation of these zones. And then you have, I think, the secondary consideration, that Himmler himself talks about, of not putting Germans under too much stress. On the second point about Austria and Czechoslovakia, the first thing I would stress here again, I mean, you're quite right. The first thing I would stress here again would be the chronology And one of the banal arguments I'm trying to make in this book is that if you go through the chronology of the Holocaust, some of the things that have to be in the chronology are precisely the destruction of Austria and the destruction of Czechoslovakia, and also the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I mean, a little bookshelf game you can play if you have a big bookshelf with books on the Holocaust is go back home and see how many of them have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the index at all, right? And it seems like even if one doesn't buy my particular argument, a moment where Germany allies with the Soviet Union and starts a Second World War would be a moment that ought to be indexed. And if you think there's any plausibility to the idea, you know, as Hannah Arendt and many others have thought, if you think there's any plausibility to the idea that citizenship has something to do with this, an action, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which led to tens of millions of people losing citizenship de facto, ought to be indexed, right? So one of the things I'm trying to push into the story is the chronology, which includes the other countries, which is why in Black Earth I have what seems, it's interesting, it seems to German historians to be a whole lot of stuff in the middle about these irrelevant countries, basically. Because the way the narration usually goes is that you have a whole lot of beautiful detail about Germany, because as we know, Germany is a very interesting country and we know the language. So you have a whole lot of beautiful detail about Germany, and then you get to this thing called the Holocaust. And so, you know, along the lines of what you're saying, what I'm trying to do is just pause and investigate what Austria means and what Czechoslovakia means and what Poland means. If from the German point of view, as you say, all that's happening is that illegitimate creations are being destroyed and restored to Germany, okay, but what does it mean from the Jewish point of view? And from the Jewish point of view, what it means is the loss of citizenship and the consequences which follow from that. So it's if we look at these, it's a simple move, but if we look at these countries before they're destroyed, we have a sense of what it means for them to be destroyed. And interestingly, it's often the Jewish sources which make this point. In Austria, the Jews make this point, but they also make this point, the point about double collaboration that I made earlier, that is extractable mostly from the Jewish sources, because the Germans almost never like to admit, oh, we got outwitted by locals, right? That's like a German telegram that one rarely reads. We got outwitted by the Slavic Untermenschen, which is what double collaboration is. It's local people reacting, I'm not praising this morally, but they're reacting intelligently to the reality of the German presence. Immediately collaborating with the Germans and then saying the Jews are the collaborators is the best way to hide your own collaboration, because you're playing to the German weakness, because that's what the Germans think is true. The Germans come in and say the Jews are communists, right? And you say, oh yes, of course the Jews are communists. It wasn't me who was a militiaman, even though it was. And therefore you have lots of Ukrainians and Belarusians who were deporting Poles and then executing Jews. And who notices that and writes it down? The Jews. Right? So the Jews leave these sources which say, isn't it funny how my neighbor collaborated with the Soviets and then blamed me for it? And from that, we then can identify this phenomenon, which again, like the Germans aren't going to see it, but sometimes what the Germans don't see is really important. And then with Austria and Czechoslovakia, in addition to the chronology and the sources, there's also the question which I ask at the beginning of the very beginning of the book, which is, okay, given what happens in Austria, fine. Austria then disappears, and usually when we read about the Holocaust, there's a moment where we talk about Austria and then it disappears. But why are the Jews killed in a suburb of Minsk? Why are the Austrian Jews killed in a suburb of Minsk? I mean, if we think that the whole story is, you know, the Germans and the anti-Semitism and so on, why weren't they killed in Vienna? Or, I mean, it's horrible enough that a few hundred of them were, but why were the Jews of Austria en masse shot in a place that none of them had ever heard of, Malý Trostinec, outside of Minsk? And the answer is because only when the Germans go into the Soviet Union and destroy the state do they create the conditions where they can kill, as it were, their own Jews. So,
thank you. Floor is open. I think your hand went up first.
Well, I have two rather different questions. And one, of course, I mean, I understand that the story that I would have heard of the Holocaust in the 60s and 70s would have been for people from Western Europe. But there's the Dutch, who lose their own Jews in a society that had been one of the most hospitable going back until the 17th century in large numbers, and not just the Anna Franks who arrived from Germany. And the other is somebody who works on Jews in the 1930s, the visceral fear you get already in letters in 33, and certainly after Kristallnacht, people who are fleeing and people who are then going to every possible length they can to get their families out after Kristallnacht. That there is, although you do have to deport people outside your country to kill them in large numbers, there are people in 33, 34, 35, 36 who are terrified for their lives and feel certain that if they stay a few more weeks, and these are not people who are communists, who have any left-wing associations, and they're going in large numbers when they can, or sending their children when they can.
Sure. And that's all very significant, but if we, I'm going to start from the second question. If we stop in 1939 and pretend we don't know what happens next, or if you want to like run it as a different counterfactual, if the assassination attempt on Hitler in November 39 succeeds, as it came within a hairbreadth of doing, those fears would not have seemed so different from the fears of Jews in Poland who were undergoing also massive pogroms in 38 and 39. They would not have seemed so different from the fears of Jews in Romania who were fleeing. Also not so different from the fears of Jews in the Soviet Union. Many more Jews were killed in the Soviet Union in the 30s, actually by orders of magnitude, than in any of these other countries, not as Jews, but as part of the terror.
And not so much exile, whereas half the German community leaves because they're
right. But it's a small community, right? And you're talking about a very small community of Jews. And many more Polish Jews would have gone, but nobody would take them. I mean, this whole business of America not being willing to take Polish citizens doesn't start in 1939. It's the course. It's one of the defining features of Polish statehood is that whereas the United States of America took people from those territories before 1918, it doesn't take many from 1918 to 1939. So if we're going to try to measure how objectively afraid people were, you have to also consider the size of the populations and the size of the quota in the United States. But I mean, I'm sure you'll agree with me that in Poland and Romania and the Soviet Union it wasn't great. And if you look at documents from people who, not just the German Jews themselves, but documents from Jews who were looking at the whole situation, right? Whether, like, say, it's the Jewish Authority or other Zionists. What's striking about those documents is that they tend to put Germany in a group along with Romania, Poland, and the Soviet Union, and talk about how things are bad one way in this country, they're bad another way in this country, they're bad another way in this country. And I think that's worth pausing and reflecting upon. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you that those kinds of policies can lead to flight, and they did. But they can't lead to a Holocaust, and they didn't. That's the argument.
The fear of murder.
Yeah, of course. I'm not saying right, but the Holocaust is the murder of 5.7 million Jews. That's not the same thing as the flight of 150,000. It's a completely. I mean, the things that we need to explain the flight of 150,000 people are different than what we need to explain the murder of 5.7 million people. And even when those German Jews are killed, they're only killed after Germany has the places to kill them in. They're not killed in Germany, right? They're not killed in pre-war Germany. Some of them are
for Kristallnacht and the people who are killed in the concentration camps. It's not the same orders of magnitude, but it is not insignificant in relation to the size of the community, which is why you have such fear already well before.
No, I agree. I just and I write about this too, but that is not going to explain for us the Holocaust. There isn't a narrative or a causal force in that which is going to get us to the Holocaust. There are other people who have other reasons for fear in Europe. There are other people who have much greater reasons for fear in Europe at that time and who are also running away and trying to flee. And in those situations, there isn't a Holocaust. What we need to be able to explain is how one way to put the question is, why is it that most German Jews survive, right? Why do most German Jews survive and most Soviet Jews who were under German occupation do not? And in order to get to that, one has to move into, I missed Robert's first point, which is very well taken. What's special about the German state is that efficiency is applied to the destruction of other states. So my argument is not that Germany doesn't exist as a state. My argument is that the German statehood is an instrument for destroying other states, which is not entirely unprecedented in the history of colonialism, by the way, or in the history of the U.S. for that matter. But it's that's the thing. I mean, the claim is never that Germany isn't a state. The claim is that Germany, the special thing about, and so your point about the concentration camps is very well taken, because the concentration camps show what happens with statelessness, but still on a relatively small scale. When you then put the SS in charge of much larger territories, you then get a difference, which becomes a difference in quality. The Dutch, yeah, I mean the Dutch, that your point is my point, because if it were anti-Semitism or the lack thereof, which we take as our predictor of how Jews are going to fare, then we let's say we know nothing about what actually happens, but we just take our own views or contemporary views about anti-Semitism, then we and contemporaries would both say the Dutch Jews will do the best, but they don't. And that's, by the way, true for Europe as a whole. If you took a survey of Holocaust specialists about the level of anti-Semitism, whatever that, however we might come to our conclusions, or if you look at contemporary sources, there is no correlation between levels of anti-Semitism and how many Jews survive in a certain part of Europe. So, I mean, your question is my argument. I mean, what one has to explain, and people were asking this question in 1943 and 44 too. Why are so many more Dutch Jews dying than French Jews when everyone knows that the French are so much more anti-Semitic? Right? That's the question as it was posed in Western Europe at the time. And the answer is that the French occupation, I mean, there's a lot to say about France, but very briefly, the answer is that the French occupation was a fairly conventional military occupation in which the French state retained, in most material respects, its sovereignty, whereas the Dutch occupation was by far the harshest German occupation in Western Europe. It's the one that's most like the East because it was carried out by the SS, who brought in very serious numbers of their own personnel. And I can go through the details, but that's the explanation.
Thank you. Chisholm and Andrew,
yeah.
Whichever way you want to.
I would like to hear a little bit more on how you situate yourself in Black Earth vis-a-vis the work of Raul Hilberg, whose work has just been recently celebrated or remarked upon in the conference that took place in Berlin the last couple of days. Because some of the things that you mentioned, the ecology aspect, you can also do with Hilberg, but within another slightly different paradigm. When he talks about the ecology of death camps, there's a clear point here. So I just wonder where you situate yourself.
Yeah. So I was trying there's so much, as you know, Holocaust historiography, and there's so many stars in the firmament, towards which one could align oneself. So I tried very hard in the book not to do that, not to begin with the gesture of where I am vis-a-vis the institutionalists and where I am vis-a-vis the intentionalists. But what I would say about Hilberg is that, and the most important things about Hilberg is that what he achieved in the time is unbelievable, right? I mean, the fact that somebody could achieve a synthesis like that with so little to lean on, I find remarkable. And the thing that you say about Hilberg, I completely agree with, which is that there is no argument about the Holocaust that anybody ever makes, no matter how seemingly unorthodox, that is not somewhere in Hilberg. Everything that, even my argument about state destruction, which actually flies in the face of his basic trend of argument, even that, he has a footnote where he talks about how the percentage of Jews who die actually correlates quite strongly to how thoroughly the state was destroyed. So basically every argument that everybody has ever made, I think it's like where Russian literature comes out of, Gogol's Overcoat. I mean, basically everything that anybody has ever said, I think, is somewhere to be found in Hilberg. Now, there's some basic differences. One is I'm strongly resisting a tradition which he in a way justifies by his very existence, which is the tradition of monolingual research. Hilberg, there are a number of cases of researchers of the Holocaust who might, even for biographical reasons, have used other languages but didn't. And my claim is that, for basic historiographical reasons, we generally write about empire when we can using reciprocal sources and not just the sources of the imperial power, but also that languages other than German not only give you perspectives, which is the moral argument, but also give you arguments, that the Jews just notice things that you're not going to see. And so that's where I differ from Hilberg. It's beyond the obvious way, which is that I'm trying to work with a politics of non-politics. I'm trying to describe a politics which can't be reached by, let's call it hybrid or permutated versions of German administration. I mean, what Hilberg does to miraculous effect is he shows you how far the German sources can take you, and he shows you what German power looks like at all these nooks and crannies. It's extraordinary that you can do that, and I don't even vaguely pretend that my book has that kind of detail or reach. But what I'm trying to describe is a situation which Hilberg, I think, doesn't and can't describe, which is the politics of state destruction, or the politics where what happens when you follow the chronology of how basic political units are removed. Or to put it in a different way, maybe a simpler way, in my book, there are multiple political actors that exist in 1939 or 38, and I'm trying to see what happens when they go away. That's different from Hilberg. Hilberg is trying to see what happens when a German power, which in the first part of his book he's already brought to its perverted extreme, what that power looks like elsewhere. Right? That's something which is pretty common in the field. In a different way, that's what Saul Friedlander does. As you get the German state to where you need it in the first part, and then in the next parts you show what that power looks like elsewhere. I'm working against that.
I think we've got time for two more questions before we continue the conversation in the more different surroundings in the common room. But Cheto.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, sir. I haven't felt this way since I read Modernity and the Holocaust by Bauman, so this is amazing. I had a few philosophical questions. So the first one is this Hitler's idea of the rejection of any kind of solidarity, whether it's Christian or Jewish or communist or kind of liberal. How related is this belief to Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, and how much is it the child of that philosophical tradition? Second thing I wanted to ask, you talked about statelessness and the creation of this situation of statelessness. So what are the implications of your argument for Arendt's banality of evil? Is there still space for the banality of evil in this situation of statelessness, where the point is not about the existence of bureaucracy, but actually the absence of bureaucracy, and that's exactly what she was arguing, that banality of evil was the child of bureaucracy. So thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with Arendt. My view about Arendt is generally that even when she's wrong, she's right. That, like, dialectically, when she's wrong, even when she's wrong, like, you can find in her you can find an argument beneath her claim, which, when you change the empirical priors a little bit, then turns out to be right. So, with banality of evil, as you will know, what Arendt is primarily concerned with in that book, as elsewhere when she reflects on the Holocaust, is a condition of thoughtlessness. So Arendt is what Arendt thinks that she starts with a basic error in ethics, which is not recognizing the other as an ethical being, and for her that's. You'll have to correct the way I talk about this, but for her, it's a kind of epistemic problem, that what philosophy has to begin with the recognition that there are other minds in the room. Thinking begins with a recognition that there are other thoughts, and so the whole empirical apparatus of banality of Eichmann in Jerusalem is meant to get us to see Eichmann as a thoughtless person in that sense. And so the way that she could be right, even if she's wrong, is that it might not be that it's bureaucracy which does that work. I don't personally think that it is. I mean, I think it does it to some extent, but I actually think that argument is actually is a German excuse a little bit. And it was actually made as a German excuse by Germans shortly after the war, that we were just a piece of a machine, and whereas in fact there's some of the people who were making that argument themselves had stood over death pits. But what if it's the case that we're much better at seeing people as people especially in a world before any notion of human rights, well, okay, I'll bracket that because that could be contested, but we're much better at seeing people as people when they are in a political realm. And that if I can take you out of the political realm completely, it then becomes very hard for other people to treat you. Like if one imagines, if I can point a finger at you, it's just so evil that I'm not even going to do it. But if I could point a finger at you and make you stateless, your life from that moment would change in this university, in this country, the way people would treat you. I mean, we don't need, we don't need to refer, to the all too obvious case of, refugees to make this point. So it may be that she's right, but that the thing that makes it easy for people to dismiss others as people is the stateless condition. And then we refugees, she comes very close to saying that, actually, in 1943. And then, to flip this around, in a part of the book that I didn't talk about, I write about the Diplomat Rescuers, who had two things going for them. One thing was that they had this almost magical ability to reconfer state recognition upon people. So Sugihara in Lithuania, and Karl Lutz and Raul Hilberg in Budapest. These are people who can save thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews because they can themselves confer a kind of state recognition. They can give people papers. So they had to be clever about it. But that's the other part, is that they had a thought, right? I mean, diplomats could do this, but most of them didn't. A few did, but the ones who did clearly had some kind of a thought. Wallenberg wanted to do it. There was something special about Sugihara, as Jews remembered him, as other people remembered him too. Like they could do it, but there was something in them that made them more likely to show solidarity with other people. Okay, on the first question, Nietzsche. I don't think it's Nietzsche. Nietzsche's attitude towards Jews is much more. I mean, as I read him, you're probably a better reader, but as I read Nietzsche, his attitude towards Jews is much more ambiguous. I mean, Jews have a power to create a civilization, which we now find ourselves in, and it's up to us to break out of that civilization. But that's not the same thing as thinking that that civilization is entirely evil, and that in order to remove that civilization, we have to actually remove its creators. I think that's a long way from Nietzsche. I think that, Hitler is a kind of, one of the things that I do in Black Earth is that I take the whole first chapter and I try to explain Hitler's thought. And I do think that it's coherent, but it doesn't, it's coherent in itself. It's very hard, though, to put it in a clear genealogy because he's grabbing things from here and there. Certainly, Victorian science is very important to him because he thinks Victorian science is science, right? He thinks, okay, we've figured out it's the survival of the fittest, that's it. And of course, the science of 1924 has all kinds of other things to say that are less determinist and less reductionist and more self-aware. But he thinks that science is what a reductive reader of, a very reductive reader of Darwin would have thought it was. And then another, so this whole idea that the Jews are responsible for all bad ideas, that gets, in my view, colleagues discuss this, but in my view, that view gets completed in 1919. It doesn't come from a philosophical source. It comes from white Russians, immigrants from the Russian Civil War, who are bringing the protocols of the Elders of Zion physically, but also bringing the idea that the Jews are responsible for communism. Hitler, up to that point, was more conventional. He thought the Jews were responsible for capitalism. Hitler was anti-capitalist. And then they're anti-capitalist. They're responsible for capitalism and communism. And from what might seem like, that's the thing that people always make fun of when they make fun of Hitler. But what Hitler does is he says, the thing that these things have in common is that they both require recognition. So whether it's a contract or whether it's working class solidarity, it's still recognition. So they're both equally Jewish ideas, just like Christianity. Right. So as I read him, it's the arrival in 1919 of that idea which closes the circle, and it's not philosophy. It's just a conspiracy theory.
If you don't mind, if we, as we're running out of time, if we take your questions together in one round, would you be happy with that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, yeah. It's also a philosophical question, a more general academic one maybe. I'm not a historian, a proper historian, I'm a music historian, but it's by extension probably related. And it's about your understanding of what an academic in today's world has to do in relation to your historical work. Now, in your recent work, as far as I see it, you have embarked on another attempt maybe to enliven Marx's thesis that philosopher and by extension the academic has to change the world, not just to explain it, to discuss it. And you do that on the basis of your groundbreaking work. And in today's post-truth debate that we are all having, where facts are sort of put into to the back burner and are tweaked as necessary in order to explain an ideology. That, of course, relates to how you describe the party state. When in Black Earth you discuss how Hitler rejects or ignores the concept that you might actually use fertilizer to feed your people rather than, no, we still need all that land. So there's an example for that, and that is what happens today in different contexts again. And when you said, for instance, that there are many Holocaust conferences that don't talk about the Holocaust, but about the understanding of people of the Holocaust, in some way that's similar, because it is about a secondary meta, whatever, level that talks about what we make of it rather than what the facts are, or let's to a lesser degree what the facts are. So the relationship between facts and our ideology and how we should use this today in order to deal with the world, that I think in all countries that we work in Western countries certainly, I feel a certain need to engage with students, for example, all the time. And how do you see that for yourself?
I think the question was so beautifully put. It's going to be better than the answer. But anyway.
I can match that, but I'll try. You started your talk with a brief comment about relationship of history to memory. You said that approximately 70% of all conferences have now to do with memory of the Holocaust rather than the Holocaust.
More than 90%.
90% even. I work in memory studies, so
you win.
I wonder whether...
I said you win.
No, it's not about that. It's about the relationship, because it seemed to me that you try to resurrect the opposition between history and memory in very hard terms, and I don't think that's necessarily necessary. And in your talk then, you actually used examples that are not hard historical facts. You quoted poetry, and you used at the end of your talk a narrative of a woman who tries to survive, who talks to a man who saves her life. It's a lovely story, but it's a story. So I wondered about why you see the need to resurrect the binary between history and memory in such strong terms, especially since your argument actually drew on material that is not necessarily historical in the first instance.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take these in reverse order. There's a kind of relationship between them. So I tried to explain, I'm not, with the limited amount of time, I'm not going to go into all the ways that history and memory relate to each other. Of course, there's a basic sense in which history cannot happen without memory, because history depends on written sources, and written sources depend upon people's memory. But there is in the field, I think, the tendency which I described, which is, it's not to say that memory studies aren't of value. It is to say that any approach can cut off other approaches. And as a matter of I'm going to say it, as a matter of fact, if you look at the history of the historiography of the Holocaust, there was a memorial turn in which memory took up more and more and more of the field, and does. I will now fall back on the facts and the numbers about this. If you look at not just the percentage of conferences, but the percentage of papers at the major Holocaust conferences, that percentage also is more and more and more about memory. And just anecdotally, when people ask me questions about the Holocaust, they're almost always questions which assume that we know what the thing is. And so when I came into this field, I'm answering your question as straightforwardly and personally as I can. I came into this field from another place. I came into it as an East European historian who just happens to know German, because German is one of the languages that we're supposed to know. And I was really struck by the highly memorial character of the field in the absence of basic knowledge about what actually happened. So the average person working on the Holocaust in the English-speaking world still thinks that the Holocaust happens in concentration camps. which is just not true. I mean, it's like thinking the Civil War happened in Nevada. It's just not true, right? And so I'm very interested in memory. I've written a lot about memory. The Reconstruction of Nations is almost entirely about memory. I spend a great deal of time on those issues, and a lot of my work is about timescapes, and I'm perfectly capable of taking these things and working them out in sophisticated ways. But on this question, where the whole rationale for putting it at the center of memorial culture was that it was so important, and yet it seemed to me that people didn't actually know why it was so important. That's what I'm going after. So I don't think that I'm making any kind of, I don't think I need to make a hard distinction between one and the other, nor do I think such a thing is really possible. But I am talking about where the field was, or still is, right? When I wrote this in 2014, when I say that basic things like the Holocaust started, with an order to kill women and children, that half the Holocaust took place by shootings, that many, if not most, of the collaborators were double collaborators in the East. These things are just not known in the field. And my move is to say, if we're going to take the Holocaust seriously, then we have to have the most important facts in the discussion. My interpretations are not the only possible interpretations, but I would ride very hard, for example, on the thing I said earlier, that if the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is not in the story, then that means the tail is wagging the dog. That what we think has happened is driving the way we write about it, as opposed to the things we can figure out that have happened. The other thing with memory is that, so now what you say about, it's nice what you say about the sources, but for me, the very striking thing is the way that focusing on memory can lead to the use of sources that are convenient as opposed to sources that are inconvenient. Because if we're going to do them a memory, we can do the memory of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. We can do the memory of our own nation, or we can do the memory of a specific thing. If we're going to do the Holocaust, then these sources take on a different meaning, right? So for me, like Elena Lipschitz, that's not a story. I'm giving it to you the best I can because, for reasons of pedagogy and argumentation, but that is a 7-page document in New York, written in Polish, which was deposited in 1948, right? Which I read, and which nobody else has read. And there's a whole lot more of that stuff to be read. And I may be able to do things with it that sound, poetic. And in that sense, I'm happy that you said so. But for me, that's a historical source. And for me, there's a great sadness that we've gone so far in the memorialization of the more familiar but less important parts of the Holocaust, and have done so little with the memorialization in Ukraine and Belarus and in Russia. For me, that's a great sadness. It's a great sadness for me that so few people in the field writ large have learned Yiddish. If we were serious about memory, we would be serious about a language which every German and historian of Germany can learn in a weekend. We would be, or 6 weeks. If we were serious about the memory of Jews, we would be learning Yiddish, right? All of us. So anyway, I'm trying to answer your question. All right, on this, your question was a much more beautiful answer to your question than I've ever given in response to that question, because what you point out is a common point between what I regard as my two vocations. So I believe that being a historian is one vocation, and I believe that being, an advocate or a civic activist or an engaged intellectual or what have you is a different vocation, where the rules are a bit different. So I spend a lot of my time now talk in very different sorts of settings, with groups of political activists late at night, or with people in retirement centers or synagogues or churches who are trying to figure out what to do in the United States of America. And I'm really glad I'm doing that. I'm really glad that I'm doing something. And of course, the way that I engage and the kinds of things I talk about are quite different. But what you've done in your question is you've identified something which actually brings the two vocations together. Usually when I answer this form of question, I'm trying to explain what's different about public political work and about historical research. But you've actually identified something fundamental, which I think is the same, or which enables both, which is the concern for factuality, which has a convenient, but I think also morally sound overlap. I cannot imagine pursuing history, whether it's the history of memory or whether it's the history of something else, without the normative pursuit of factuality, which I'm happy to accept, every possible reservation and, treat it as an asymptotic thing, right? I realize I'm never like, if Kant couldn't do it, I can't either. But that normative pursuit is a thing which unites both. Because as you've also suggested, more elegantly than I'm going to, in the present political climate, the pursuit of factuality is a political act. You cannot pursue factuality without changing the political world around you, because the political world that we're living in is one that is, this is interesting, the genre is actually really important here. The world that we're living in here has a fictional character. I'm now going to work this out for a second. Can I work this out for a second? So when Boris Yeltsin was sick and drunk and they were looking for a successor, the political technologists around him in the Kremlin had an opinion poll to find out who the most popular character in Russian television was. And then, having identified that character, they looked for the person in real life who was most like that character. The character was called Max Stirlitz, and he was a Soviet double agent in Germany, a German-speaking Soviet spy. And for that reason, they tracked down Vladimir Putin. Now shift to America, where you have a multiple failure as a real estate developer, a man called Donald Trump, who owes billions of dollars to dozens of banks, has bankrupted 6 companies, who is then bailed out by people very close to the first fictional character, bailed out in the literal financial sense in the 90s and in the 2000s, at which point this Mr. Trump becomes a television character himself. On television, he plays a successful real estate developer, which he's never been. And as a successful real estate developer, he then fires people, and that becomes his thing. But it's a fiction. He never was that thing. He's playing a character on television. So one fictional character crosses a line into reality, and then helps another fictional character cross the line into reality, because then this person becomes the president of another country. And both of them generate the everyday sort of barrage of untruth, but they also generate these larger incoherent fictions, like that Mr. Obama wasn't born in the United States of America, which more than half the Republicans in the United States believe. And that these fictions take up space. And so just these things which we would regard, I think, all of us, as our everyday scholarly duty, then when we apply them more broadly without changing our ethics, then take on a political character. And that, you're right, that's an awful lot of what I'm doing right now, is doing that and then trying to find ways of saying it that people will pay attention to.
Thank you. Well, perfect way to end a really stimulating afternoon, I think. We will continue the discussion, as I said, in the common room. Everyone can join us there. And thanks to Tim for coming to Dublin, and thank you for...
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you. Thank you all very much.